All right. Well, welcome. My name is Kat Polk, and I'm the Executive Director of the North Carolina Composting Council. Happy International Compost Awareness Week to you all. Thanks for coming to our Lunch and Learn webinar about adding food waste to a composting facility. Before I introduce our panelists and our presenters, I'm just going to share a little bit more about the North Carolina Composting Council. Since 2007, the North Carolina Composting Council, also known as NCCC, has been an authorized affiliate organization of the U.S. Composting Council, also known as the USCC. NCCC promotes the programs and activities of the USCC to advance composting and promote compost use, to enhance soils and provide economic and environmental benefits for our members and society. So if you are a member of the U.S. Composting Council and you live in North Carolina, then you would automatically also become a North Carolina Composting Council member. And membership to the council enables us to encourage and guide research, to promote best composting practices, to educate professionals and the public, to enhance product quality and markets. And then in return, members receive discounts to the annual USCC conference, webinars, and other ticketed events. And then the North Carolina Composting Council is a volunteer-run, member-based organization dedicated to the development, expansion, and promotion of composting and compost use in both the domestic and industry settings. Our work is based on sound science, principles of sustainability, and economic viability. And we are an active volunteer-run grassroots organization. We provide community outreach and engagement, educational events and webinars, professional support and networking. We have an annual micro grant for $1,000, 3 projects available each fall. We lead a 5-day compost operations training course in partnership with the Compost Research Education Foundation. This year in North Carolina, that's scheduled for September 8th through the 12th. We host sustainable spirits events around the state, which are informal social networking events. We advocate for compost-friendly policy and legislation, and then we also engage in organizational partnerships and have sponsors which enable us to do our work. And then down here in green, these are the committees where people can volunteer and engage with NCCC to help us do our work. So we have our board of directors, and then we also have our education and outreach committee, an advocacy and access committee, a regional group in the coastal composting chapter, and then our compost operations training course planning committee. And I just want to give a quick thank you to our generous sponsors for enabling us to host webinars like this. So thank you to our gold sponsors, Vermeer Allroads and Sustainable Generation. And thank you to our bronze sponsors, McGill Environmental and SCS Engineers. And now I am very happy to introduce you all to our panelists for today. We have Betsy LaForce and Orion Black Brown from Green Mountain Technologies, and they will share a bulk of the presentation with us. So y'all are welcome to say hi to everybody.
Hey guys, Orion with Green Mountain Technologies.
Good afternoon. I'm Betsy LaForce, also with Green Mountain Technologies. I live in South Carolina. And Orion, do you want to say where you're calling in from?
Yes, I am calling in from Hawaii, and it is quite early, so you'll have to bear with me if I'm rubbing my eyes periodically,
Thanks for
but
coming.
excited to be here.
Awesome. And after their presentation, we have 4 North Carolina experts to represent or to answer the questions on a panel. So we have Riley Alber, Matt Ball, Patrick Downey, and Muriel Williman. Y'all are welcome to turn on your cameras. We have Riley Alber is from Wilmington Compost Company.
Good afternoon, everybody. Riley, like Kat said, with Wilmington Compost Company here in Wilmington, North Carolina, along the coast. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Riley. We have Matt Ball from NC State University's Composting and Research Cooperative.
Hey, everybody. Matt Ball with NC State. Part of what I do over here is manage the compost facility and research cooperative. Happy to be on board.
Thanks, Matt. We have Patrick Downey with us from McGill Environmental.
Good morning. Happy to be here with McGill Environmental. I am the intake sales representative for the entire state of North Carolina. So my job is just to make sure the right things come in and the wrong things stay out.
That's wonderful. Great work, Patrick. And then we also have Muriel Williman here from the City of Durham, and she's also the NCCC Board President.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
It's great to have you.
I'll just say really quickly, the City of Durham operates 2 composting facilities. We have a type 1 yard waste composting facility and a type 4 biosolids composting facility that we'll talk more about on the panel. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, great work to you as well, Muriel. Thanks you all for coming. So I'm now going to pass it over to Betsy LaForce and Orion to give a presentation about composting food waste.
Thank you so much, Kat. It's an honor to kick things off. Thanks again to all the participants for registering and taking the time to join us during this International Compost Awareness Week, really bringing together folks from all over the country and different areas of the industry. So exciting topic. A little bit about GMT for those of you that may not be familiar. We are a family-owned and operated company with over 30 years of experience operating and designing compost facilities. We've designed and built more than 400 compost facilities around the world of all different scales. Next slide, please. Today, Orion and I will be giving a quick overview, which is drawn from a full-day workshop that GMT offers at the annual United States Compost Council conference. So we've condensed 6 hours of in-depth information into about 35 minutes. So really just sharing the highlights today. We'll touch on the state of food waste composting in North Carolina, how food waste as a feedstock is different, and key technologies and opportunities in the space. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but we're glad to make the connection with everyone. And if you have questions afterwards, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Our contact info will be shared at the end. Next slide, please. Our mission is to make composting accessible, affordable, and environmentally sustainable. Since 1992, we've focused on reducing barriers and advancing aerobic composting to support communities all around the world. This year's ICAW theme is Sustainable Communities Begin with Compost, so it's perfect timing for this topic. Next slide. We've worked with thousands of clients through consulting and different design projects, and our track record really reflects our commitment to innovation and practical solutions for diverse composting projects and scales. Next slide. As you can see, over the years, we are continually refining our technologies, composting systems, and expanding our expertise to meet the ever-evolving compost industry needs. This development journey underscores our dedication to leadership in composting solutions. Next slide. In North Carolina, the composting infrastructure for food waste is continuing to grow with many permitted facilities and drop sites already in place. This expansion offers opportunities to increase capacity, accessibility, and include a wider variety of feedstocks to be composted. For smaller scale operations in the state, those managing less than 100 cubic yards on less than an acre, North Carolina offers exemptions, which helps lower barriers and encourages local and community-based composting. Next slide. Interestingly, according to the EPA, only about 5% of organic waste in the US is currently being composted. This highlights just how much potential there is to increase composting efforts and divert more organic material away from our landfills. Next slide. Since 1990, composting has increased tenfold, mostly from composting yard waste. Many states, including North and South Carolina, have had yard waste bans in place for decades. The idea behind this is to save landfill space. The city of Durham, for example, as Muriel mentioned, is using shredded yard waste from their Class 1 facility to mix with the biosolids that are being composted at the Class 4 facility. So shredded yard waste is an excellent carbon source. It's perfect for balancing food waste in compost recipes that are all about that ratio of carbon and nitrogen. Next slide. NCDEQ data shows that North Carolina has 58 compost facilities. This map may need updating, but it gives a good overview of the permitted sites. The green dots are type 1 facilities, brown dots are type 2, blue dots are type 3, and purple dots are type 4. The yellow highlighted ring indicates that food waste is accepted. So a key takeaway here is the amount of permitted capacity that's available specifically for type 1 facilities, which don't accept food waste. So there's potential to leverage this permitted land for more diversion away from the landfill by adding different feedstocks beyond just green waste and yard waste. Since the land is already permitted, it lowers one of the biggest and acquired, it lowers one of the biggest barriers to entry for composting, which is acquiring land. Permitting can be a challenge, but it's often easier to add a permit tier to an existing facility than it is to start from scratch. That's a good question for our panel later. How can we make this process smoother? Next slide, please. Before we dive into the permit levels, let's quickly consider some of the many co-benefits of composting. It offers opportunities to conserve our land, improve water and air quality, protect against flooding and drought impacts, create jobs, and boost community and environmental literacy. Next slide, please. Now let's take a look at the different types of compost permits in North Carolina. The tiered approach helps streamline the process, and it provides exemptions for smaller scale operations, making it easier for those community level folks to get started and scale up from there if desired. Next slide. Exemptions apply to operations managing less than 100 cubic yards of material at all times on areas smaller than an acre. These facilities can handle various feedstocks, including food waste, yard waste, manure, and others. Leachate control is required, meaning systems must be in place to manage liquids draining from the piles. Proper leachate management is key to preventing contamination and complying with regulations. This involves basic infrastructure like collection systems and regular monitoring to ensure everything functions properly. Overall, these exemptions lower barriers for small composters while maintaining those important environmental protections. Next slide. So type 1 facilities, the most abundant. These are small-scale composters that mainly manage yard waste and other organics. They are really important for local waste diversion, methane reduction, and for producing high-quality compost. As we saw on the DEQ map, there are many existing type 1 facilities across the state. And so expanding their capacity to process more feedstocks, like adding food waste, could really significantly boost organic diversion efforts for the state and our country. Next slide. Type 2 facilities are larger than type 1, handling greater volumes of organics, including some post-consumer waste and sometimes even meat-based materials. They do need a proper pad like an impermeable liner or finer sand and leachate control systems to manage those liquids. So again, upgrading and expanding upon these existing facilities can greatly boost organics diversion and resource recovery. Next slide. Type 3 facilities, these are even larger operations. They can process higher volumes of various organic waste streams, including wood and even some contaminated materials. These facilities typically have more infrastructure, such as proper liners to contain liquids and robust systems in place to control those odors and leachate. This photo is from one of our panelists, Riley's facilities in Wilmington, that he can talk a little bit more about later. Next slide. And type 4 facilities. So this is the biosolids facility in Durham, an example of a type 4 operation. These are the really large regional facilities that are designed for maximum resource recovery, often with advanced systems in place to extract nutrients and other valuable materials. Next slide. So now we're going to transition into talking about why food waste as a feedstock is unique. It's often stinky, it's energy intensive to manage, and oftentimes it contains plastics or other scary contaminants. Food waste is not homogeneous. It has a high odor potential. It can be contaminated. So all of these elements present specific challenges. Orion has a lot of experience designing facilities all around the world to address these various issues, specifically with food waste. So with that, I will hand it over to Orion to dive a little deeper into some of those special considerations for food waste management and technologies.
Yeah, hey everybody. Thanks for the introduction here, Betsy. So yeah, to kick this off, I wanted to ask a question, but I believe none of you can speak. So I'm going to ask this question rhetorically. And the question is, which of these is food waste? And the correct answer is that they are all food waste. So these are all different food waste streams. And the point I really want to make is that food waste is this very wide-ranging topic. It covers all sorts of different waste streams. And food waste itself is very ambiguous. You know, it could be packaged bread, it could be an apple, it could be a watermelon, it could be a whole chicken. So when we talk about food waste and we start thinking about composting, it's not one thing, and that means that we have to have a certain amount of flexibility baked into the way we process it. Next slide, please. So there's different acronyms that get thrown around in the waste industry around food waste, and these refer to the places that the food waste comes from. And I just want to quickly go through these to kind of demystify some of these acronyms. The first one, and probably the most common, is source separated organics, or SSO. And this refers to like a co-collected food waste, green waste stream typically. So if you could imagine, I'm not sure if you guys have this in North Carolina, but we have this throughout the West Coast where a lot of cities have a green bin. And in that green bin, you can put your yard waste, your green waste, and you can also put your food waste. So that would be considered a source separated organic because at the source, you are separating the organic from the trash. And these typically have lower rates of contamination and also usually pretty low amounts of food waste. And it's a great way to get food waste diversion up. FOGO is a term that's used more outside of the United States, and it's very broad. It means food organics, green organics. Oftentimes it refers to SSO, but it can be really anything. It's more commonly used in like New Zealand, Australia, and throughout Europe. Europe will also call it bio-waste sometimes. Another one is the organic fraction of municipal solid waste being trash. And this is basically if you have a non-separated waste stream, basically trash, and you're putting everything into that trash can. So you're putting your organic matter, your plastics, your glass, whatever it is, it all goes in there. And then you take that waste stream and you mechanically separate it. So the organic fraction after mechanical separation would be considered OFM-SW. And this stuff is super contaminated and but you can actually turn it into compost. So it can be a resource as well. And then there's ICI, which is institutional, commercial, and industrial. So this is waste streams that come from all sorts of different places, but it's sort of the umbrella outside of SSO. And this would be like waste from a hotel or an airport or a mall or some sort of industrial facility. And typically these waste streams are a lot more contaminated. So you look at much higher amounts of plastic. And this is because if you ever look into the compost bin at like an airport or a mall or something like that, you'll typically see there's a lot more trash in there just because people might not be aware of which one's the compost bin, which one's the trash container, so on and so forth, or maybe they're just not educated in source separation because they don't have source separation from where they're from. So you just have maybe a tragedy of the commons, which leads to a lot more contamination. Then there's also pre-consumer food waste. This would be if you had like a massive manufacturing plant. It actually doesn't have to be massive, it can be tiny, but some sort of manufacturing plant that was making like cereal or something, and there's a waste stream that came from that you know, the food never even hits the market. So this is usually really, really clean and really homogeneous. So this can be a great stream to look at composting because it's much cleaner, typically pretty consistent, typically pretty homogeneous. And then last, but definitely not least, is depack waste, which is becoming increasingly relevant. And this is waste stream that's going through a depackager. And it's not really an acronym or anything, but I thought it was worth mentioning because this is becoming increasingly a great source of food waste. And this is, typically stuff that spoils at restaurants or at grocery stores. So it could be like canned soda or bagged lettuce, things like that. And you put it through a depack that pulls whatever the packaging is away from it. Next slide, please. So yeah, very quickly, just want to touch on like why one would even compost food waste to begin with. From like a financial standpoint, there's obviously all sorts of environmental benefits to composting food waste, as Betsy mentioned earlier. But there's this stream that adds complications, it comes with contamination, so on and so forth. So why would you want to touch it? And I'll give you a few reasons and also a few considerations. First and foremost, oftentimes food waste comes with a higher tipping fee. So usually you're looking at a tipping fee pretty similar to what a landfill would charge. And I believe Betsy told me this is around $50 in North Carolina, but I'm sure some of our presenters can elaborate on that. You can have a higher finished compost value as well because food waste has a lot of nitrogen in it. And I added an asterisk here just because this is very contingent on whether or not you can manage contamination. So if you actually end up with a lot of contamination in your product, it can actually bring the product value down. There's a huge opportunity with food waste composting. I mean, right now, as Betsy was saying, a very small amount of the overall waste is actually being composted. And when you look at that graph, just a tiny, tiny percentage of it is food waste. So there's so much opportunity for growth here. And we're seeing this on the West Coast and in different places that have these organic mandates where you need to have a certain amount of organics diversion by a certain time, that any facility that's permitted to manage food waste is just in like tremendous demand right now because we have these very lofty goals about food waste diversion, but we don't have the infrastructure right now. So these facilities are seeing tipping fees sometimes well in excess of $100 a ton to accept food waste. Tipping fees for food waste are only going up, as I kind of alluded to there. Landfills are closing, food waste bans are coming. It's in many ways inevitable. So that's another part of the kind of financial consideration. The flip side of that is managing food waste has higher capital and operational costs. Usually you're at a different tier that has more stringent regulations. And also there's more of a risk of odor and potentially hurting the environment or your community. So you need to have tighter operations and usually more process control as well. Next slide. So really, really quickly, I'm not going to get too much into like the science of composting food waste because we don't have a ton of time, but there's one thing that I think is really important about food waste, and that's that it comes to your site typically acidic. And when it's acidic, you have a lot more odors. It can be much harder to get it to heat up. And basically, it just creates all sorts of problems from a composting standpoint. And Sundberg et al. Did some great research in Northern Europe about this. And they looked at the number of VOCs, volatile organic carbons, which are oftentimes associated with odor, that come from a composting process when you can really heavily aerate in the beginning versus when you don't aerate heavily in the beginning. And I'll quickly touch on why aeration is important because the composting that we do is all aerobic, and the composting that most folks do is aerobic unless you're doing a digestion process or like bokashi, where you're kind of preserving it almost. But it's aerobic, and the microbes need oxygen to do the work that we want them to do without generating a lot of odors. So they did a study looking at, okay, if we provide enough air to keep it aerobic, in these two different scenarios, the one on the right and the one on the left. But in the one on the left, we provide excess air in the beginning to help bring the pH up and stabilize it. and prolong the mesophilic stage, what does that do to the emissions over time? And as you can see on the left, in the top left graph, there's this early spike in emissions, and then it quickly falls off in as little as like 4 days. Whereas the one on the right, the emissions kind of jump up similarly to the one on the left, but then they just kind of stay the same. So you continue to emit odor. And yeah, there's a lot more we could talk about there, but I'll just kind of leave it at that. So having like heavy aeration, heavy aerobic conditions in the beginning, and really prolonging that mesophilic stage for 5-ish days is super beneficial when you're composting food waste. So yeah, I want to take some time. I mean, it's such a huge topic, but I figured we'd spend a little time looking at contamination and some contamination mitigation strategies, because that's really the hot topic with food waste composting. The photo on the right is from one of our facilities in California, and they have, as you can see, a lot of contamination. And this is after a pre-screen process. So yeah, it's just an inevitable part of oftentimes composting certain food waste streams. So I guess before saying it's totally inevitable, there are some waste streams where you can avoid contamination. And I think in the food waste space, the only place where you can really kind of guarantee you're not going to get any contamination is pre-consumer food waste. Once it hits the markets, you know, there's probably going to be at least some contamination. So it's more or less inevitable. And as I was saying, where the waste comes from really matters. So it's important to think about where your waste is coming from, your food waste is coming from, when you're kind of designing your facility. And the primary goal for you should be just to keep contamination away if possible. And that comes down to education, communication, getting the right waste streams. As I talked about earlier, not all food waste streams are the same, and the amount of contamination is going to be different. And yeah, just engagement, education, communication, all these things really, really help with your hauler, with the folks that are, if it's like an industrial producer or pre-consumer producer or a restaurant or whatever it is, the more you can talk to them and provide feedback, the better the contamination thing's going to get. And then have a plan, because it is a problem, and it's better to actually plan for it than to be surprised when it shows up. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we recommend, like looking more so at the actual operations of a compost facility, is always to inspect loads when they come to your facility, especially if it's coming from a source that could have high amounts of contamination. And as you can see, this guy's probably a little bummed looking at this waste stream coming into his compost facility. There's a lot of boxes and bags and things like that. So yeah, it's important to have someone there that's looking at that waste stream coming in. And then it's also important to have contracts and language set up with the folks that are bringing waste to your facility that allow you to reject material if it's over a certain contamination level, or charge them if it's too high a contamination level. And this will just keep people accountable and also keep you in compliance with your permits, because a lot of the permits in North Carolina, they have contamination thresholds. So this is a really important stage, and it also is important to like the continuous improvement in the amount of contamination you experience. Next slide, please. The next thing you can do is pre-screening. And typically a pre-screen process is done before grinding. And you can do like what's called a floor sort, where you dump the material out into windrows, or you kind of spread it out with a bucket loader. And then you walk through and you try to pick out large friable material. So you're not going to get all the material out typically with a pre-screen, but you want to focus on things that if you put them through a grinder or shredder are going to turn into serious contamination problems, like glass bottles, friable plastics, tires, metal that could damage your grinder, so on and so forth. You can also do this with a pick line, which just kind of optimizes a little bit more. And there was some interesting work that was done by Atlas Organics. They had a facility in Texas that was looking at using robots to remove plastics and different contaminants. kind of these AI-powered robots to remove it versus humans. And they ran the robots for about 5 years and collected a lot of data. And at the end of it, they determined that the robots didn't actually make any financial sense. They were just too ineffective and ended up costing about the same, if not more, to what a human would doing the picking work. So yeah, unfortunately, there's not really a way to automate around this at the beginning. And one challenge with pre-screening is usually food waste streams are very wet. And screeners, if you've ever operated one with wet compost, you know it doesn't work super well. So you're a little bit limited to like how much mechanical separation you can do with fresh feedstocks. Next slide, please. This is super important. And this kind of gets into what I was talking about with the pre-screening, but when you're thinking about how to manage contamination, it's really, really important to not amplify your problem. And the ways that you can amplify your problem are by primarily turning every single piece of plastic you have into 20 or 30 or 50 pieces of plastic. So the goal when you're composting anything that's contaminated is to keep your plastic as large as possible and to not turn it into more and more pieces of plastic. So some ways you can do that are you can remove things before grinding. You can try to bypass grinders with heavily contaminated loads and just mix it into your shredded carbon. You can use low-speed shredders instead of high-speed grinders. This will significantly reduce the amount of milling that happens. And then also if you're doing composting in windrows, look at purchasing a low-speed windrow turner. So the speed that that drum turns, that's going to have an impact on how much you mill the plastics. And then if you have a really, really contaminated waste stream, you could look at using a DPAC to remove some of that contamination before the composting process. And as I said, this is super important. So when you're looking at the screening, we can stay on the slide. When you're looking at screening, you want to make sure it's much, much harder to remove a lot of small pieces of plastic than it is to remove big ones. And so that's why it's super important not to mill the plastic. And then screening, this is kind of the tail end screening when you'd be screening your fines and your overs and separating them in that way, is typically you have a lot more success screening on the tail end of the composting process because you've evaporated a lot of moisture and the material's dry and it screens much more effectively. There's there's 3 ways you can get plastic out of a waste stream. One, you can just put it through a typical screener. And if you screen to like a 1/4 inch, all the plastic that's larger than a 1/4 inch, which if you've done a good job not milling it, will be the majority of it, will come out. But you'll end up with contaminated overs, which could be 20% of the mass of this waste stream. So there's some technologies that have come out that can help mitigate that. One is called a wind sifter, which is pictured on the right. And basically what that is you have this chamber, that green kind of tarped area. And as the material comes off a conveyor, there's this set of air jets that blows up at the material and it pushes any light material up into that chamber. And then you have a vacuum that pulls any of the light material off. So these can do a very effective job for removing plastic contamination if they're operated correctly. And this is mostly, lighter plastics that they're super effective at removing. You can also just use these vacuums by themselves and put them at the end of a screener or something like that. But they're definitely considerably less effective than a wind sifter. And it should be noted that both of these technologies are not 100% effective. So you're still going to end up with most likely some contamination in your overs. So have a plan for what you're going to do with your contaminated overs. Maybe it's landfill cover can be a great application. But think about that when you're thinking about your financial models around food waste composting. Next slide, please. So quickly, I'm just going to talk about a few different composting technologies that we commonly use for food waste composting. And I'll try to move through this quickly so we have some time to speak with all the panelists and ask some questions. Next slide, please. First, I want to point out that typically with composting, 50% plus of the cost of running a facility is labor. And especially, if you're looking at running a front-end loader or a grinder or something like that, these are very, very large expenses. So the way that you compost is super important into the like long-term financial sustainability of your facility, and the way you design and lay the whole thing out is all really, really important. Next slide, please. So basically, if I were to just break it down into 4 categories, there's these 4 different ways you can compost. One is static and aerated, the next is in-vessel and aerated, another is turned and aerated, and then the last is just turned or passively aerated. And we'll quickly touch on each of these in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So aerated static piles, this technology is basically you pre-mix and grind and you get everything to the right kind of homogeneous blend, and then you put it onto a series of pipes and you aerate it, and that keeps the aerobic conditions that we were talking about. The biggest advantage, I mean, I'd say ASP is pretty good across the board. It's got good odor control, reasonable capital cost, and you can process a lot of waste with it. But typically the ops cost is pretty low with ASP because the process is static. So you're not touching and moving it a lot. So that's one of the big benefits of ASP. Next slide, please. Another way to do ASP that's a little more cost effective, especially in North Carolina. One thing that's interesting about North Carolina is in most states, once you start touching food waste, you have to be on an impermeable surface, at least on the West Coast. Whereas in North Carolina, you just need to be on a finer than loamy sand soil type. And so you can compost food waste, certain types of food waste, without actually putting down an impermeable surface. And if that's the case, pipe on grade ASP can be a really cost-effective approach there. And basically, this is the same concept, except as you can kind of see in this image, the pipes are sitting on the surface of the ground instead of being embedded into concrete or asphalt. And that just lowers the capital cost quite a bit. So just wanted to point out that there's also this technology. Next slide, please. Compost covers, there's a variety of different covers. There's fleece covers, geomembrane covers. You can use a tarp. So there's all sorts of different covers. Some of the benefits of covering is that it can keep moisture in and out of the compost pile, so it gives you a little bit more control. And it can also, if you're using a geomembrane cover, provide odor control. One of the downsides is it's a bit more, especially with geomembrane covers, is they can be pretty expensive, and that you also have the added operations cost of putting them on and off. And also they limit the amount of air you can get through, so it typically makes the process time a little bit slower. Next slide, please. Turned aerated piles, this is probably my favorite way to compost. I'm slightly biased, but basically this is where you aerate, and then you're also using typically a side discharge turner, but it could also just be like a standard straddle windrow turner. And so you have the benefits of both using a windrow turner, that kind of rehomogenization and mixing, and also the benefits of doing ASP. And this allows you to make really, really high quality compost pretty quickly. And yeah, I'll leave it there for now. Next slide. And then there's in-vessel systems like tunnels, or you can compost in a building. I know McGill has a lot of experience with this, and maybe they can share a little bit more. But one of the big advantages to in-vessel composting is that you have really, really excellent odor control. So this allows you to compost in more densely populated areas, in stricter regulatory environments, so on and so forth. Oftentimes people that are composting the organic fraction of MSW will use an in-vessel technology like this just because it's so much more strictly regulated. Next slide, please. Then there's also just small kind of in-vessel systems. One that we offer is the Earthflow, but there's also drums and all sorts of other technologies. Not dehydrators, those are not composters, sadly, but they kind of serve a similar function. So yeah, these use some sort of mechanical apparatus to automate a portion of the composting process, and they're usually they are by definition completely enclosed, which allows you to keep leachate out and also contain odors. So these are typically pretty good options if you're looking at processing a small amount of food waste and you want to do it close to the source in more populated areas. Next slide, please. And then last but not least, windrow turners. Windrow turners can be an approach for composting food waste, except if you're doing food waste with windrows, you typically need to turn more aggressively, which can increase the operations cost. And I've added this kind of capital cost range because in certain scenarios, windrow turners they make a lot of sense financially, and then in other ones they don't. And with food waste, this is typically the case when you go to if you have to put the composting process on an impermeable surface for regulatory reasons. And if you have to go to an impervious surface, then doing windrow turners typically doesn't make sense because the footprint is so much larger. And that means you need to put down a lot more concrete or asphalt, which ultimately ends up being more expensive than other types of technology. Yeah, next slide. So yeah, that's it. That's all we've got for now. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll pass it off to the panelists.
Thank you all so much. That was a really outstanding presentation. So we can now invite all of our panelists to turn on your video. To all of our attendees, thank you for joining us again today. There is a Q&A box that you are welcome to put questions into that, and we will pull them from there. And thank you also to those who registered with some questions. So I'm going to go ahead and ask the questions that we received from registration and give you all some time to include more in the Q&A box. Okay, so panelists, any one of you are welcome to answer this question, and then other panelists, please feel free to also extend on others' answers if you have more to share. Okay, so the first question, thank you, is from Charles Parrish from the Interfaith Food Shuttle. And the question is, what are low-cost, low-labor depackaging solutions for food recovery providers to cost and time-effectively depackage spoiled produce for on-site composting operations? So they're asking about good low-cost, low-labor depackaging solutions. And that's a great question from Interfaith Food Shuttle, who probably deals with this on a daily basis. Do any of the panelists want to respond? Riley?
We don't necessarily work with depackaging, so I'm going to go ahead and just step aside on this one and let one of the other panelists or Green Mountain Technologies take it on.
Thanks, Riley.
Yeah, Kat, I will say the same thing. McGill doesn't have any packaging equipment. The ones that we have looked into is quite expensive, very expensive. So for smaller operations and companies, it's probably out of reach. You're looking at, having a group of people rip things open, which I'm sure Interfaith is probably doing now. And it's a pain and it's a hassle, but unfortunately, that's about the best way you can get that material done the right way is have people on hands on deck for it.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Matt. You got something.
Oh no, I was just gonna sort of double down on what Daryl mentioned. The best tool we have is just our hands. When we get food delivered to our receiving bay, the first thing we do is just jump in the pile and start getting all the easy pickings. And moving forward, every time we move material, it's just an opportunity for us to grab contamination. But again, our scale and our size, we just do it all by hand.
Yeah, I was basically gonna echo everything y'all were saying, but basically I haven't really seen a depack operation that's like under 10,000 tons per year, just because the capital cost of buying a deep, I think it's like $500,000 to $750,000. Maybe there's a smaller, cheaper one out there, but you really need to have scale to use a kind of industrial depack system. And it's pretty impressive technology. There's some depack systems that can do a really good job. It's almost like unbelievable what you see go in versus what comes out the other side. So it can do a good job, but yeah, you need that scale, unfortunately. Otherwise, you're kind of stuck with doing it with your hands.
Can I ask if it's possible to shred the material? I know that nobody likes to shred plastic. However, if then you had a vacuum, would that be an option? Is there anything smaller that you know of that might be another option for something like a food pantry that, could maybe vacuum on a conveyor?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just invented the new $1 million product, Mario. No, I don't know. I'm sure that there's ways you could get creative and kind of automate it a little bit. One of the challenges with like food waste or something like that is it's super wet. So trying to use a vacuum to pick it up can be difficult because it's so dense at that early stage. But yeah, I imagine there's ways that you could do it creatively as well.
I'll also share that one thing that we find useful is we've got a mixer that we utilize on the front end as we're processing incoming feedstock, and it's got a conveyor that then empties out into a bin right beside. And because it just kind of drops out into the bin, we're intermittently going in and out with the loader to move the material to the next step. We'll typically have someone working on site, definitely on processing days, just equipped with PPE and a rake. And because all the contamination is at least consolidated at that point, we can stand there and get a pretty good fraction out just by pulling it out with a rake as it's coming out of the conveyor, which we found is kind of our best opportunity throughout the course of the composting process, up until the point where we're screening everything out.
Thank you all. Muriel, did you want to add to that at all? Okay. Our next question was from Danny Nelson from Help Desk Schlut, Roth, and Zabel. The question is how to improve the quality of compost. For example, if I am only composting processed inorganic foods, fast foods from McDonald's, how does that affect the quality of finished compost? And there's a few questions here, but I think it's kind of all lumped into one. They're also asking how to compost cooking oil, and does adding rock dust to compost improve the quality? Humans sometimes need supplements. Are there supplements for compost?
I'll jump on I guess the first part of that question. In terms of compost quality, I subscribe to the notion that compost quality really ultimately is going to be determined by the consumer and by the end use market. So in other words, what might be considered an optimal compost product may differ from one application to the next. As an example, finished compost with a low nutrient concentration and larger particle size could be better suited for erosion control applications or mulching, whereas compost with a higher nutrient concentration, in particularly food waste compost, screened to a smaller particle size might be more beneficial when applied to annuals or turf for crops or things like that. But with that said, if the actual composting process is managed intentionally and is on the right side of the threshold for pathogens and metals and is free of physical contaminants, there's going to be a wide range of highest and best uses for that product. And as it relates to the question of processed foods, I think there's certainly a home for those in the compost pile. And, for that matter, they could just be a nice diversified nitrogen stream, with pretty good moisture boot. So I think the more diversified the waste stream, the better.
Yeah, and I'll kind of piggyback Matt on that. I'm kind of a firm believer in at our facility, we really try to source a variety of feedstocks. So not only just pre and post consumer food scraps, but we work with, different ag manures. We work with the mycology community and different mushroom growers. And so we really, from a conscious standpoint, do try to source and flush out some of those feedstock opportunities to kind of construct a really consciously crafted compost. With that, you can pick and choose. And to your question about, are there things that help composting? 100%. There are different terms in the industry. One term may be an inoculant, is kind of what you're thinking of, something to assist in the decomposition process. So that would be something to maybe consider, look into. There are different options. I'll go ahead and kind of start with this just to put the plug in. When you're talking inoculants, I firmly believe in regional micro and macrobiology. So, you do have to be conscious and careful in what inoculant you are sourcing. I think indigenous microorganisms are the best options for us as composters due to they're already adapted to the climates and ecology in which they're going to be serving and ecosystems. And so, there are different things to consider when looking into formulas, inoculants, and different types of, rock dust, azomite materials, or different amendments that may speed up, benefit, or harm the composting process. But there are different materials that can assist in that.
Yeah, and I'll just finally kind of echo what everybody else said. Betsy had said that only 5% of food waste is being, composted right now. So all food waste to us is good food waste. What Matt had said about what are you making, McGill puts out a Class A compost, but we have 5 different composts. If we're doing DOT projects, roadside projects, it's not going to be your top of the line compost. But if you got somebody who's doing landscape in a commercial building, we want it to be clean, fresh. We don't want them to dig their hands in there and find something they don't want in there while they're going through it with their hands. So it all depends on what your end product is used for and what you're going to use it for. But, any type of food, doesn't matter if it's McDonald's or, the top of the line 5-star, restaurant in your city or town. It's all good stuff.
So I heard inside that question, there was a cooking oil also. I just want to say that there's a lot of recycling markets for that particular material in North Carolina. You can actually, if you're collecting a large volume of that material, it can be used for, making biodiesel and in other, biological products. And often there are outfits that will even pay for that material. So I would say, depending on what you're producing or what you're able to collect, do your research and kind of, match the material with the facility. You're going to have to do that anyway with any collection. It's sort of, collection 101, don't pick up a crumb or a stick or a bucket until you know for sure that you have a stable market to bring it to. Cooking oil is something that composters will accept it, but there's also a higher grade use for it that I would recommend. I think also with, inorganic materials like rock dust, I think, the compost is going to have a certain composition, and mixing inorganic material at the end is more customary than adding it at the front, particularly a fine like that when what you're trying to do is create aeration, and that will have a compacting impact on the compost.
Patrick, is it right to, I'm not 100% sure, but an approaching recycling market for cooking oil, there may be some ideas around partnership available, because I'm pretty sure there's some solids generated in that process too that then could be composted after the fact. Is that right?
Yeah, there are a number of cooking oil grease, if you will, companies in every state that have to be, permitted to collect that stuff specifically. They have to have a home for it as well. We deal with 2 in North Carolina, Grease Cycle, Grease Outlet, that bring us a lot of your restaurant grease, your cooking oil, your waste from there, has some food products in it. So it's a good source for us to use, but they're out there. Just need to look them up. Thanks, Matt.
I might just add on to something that Maria was saying, which, as a composter, I like the idea of like everything should go to compost, but I do believe that composting is actually a little bit lower down on the hierarchy of best uses, especially when we're talking about food waste. Like the best thing we can do with food is eat it. We don't want to waste it. So it's not like the best thing we can do is grow all this food and then compost all of it. We want to eat as much of it as possible. And then we want to find markets for as much of it as we can before we even bring it to the compost facility. So maybe that's biodiesel, maybe it's animal feed. There's all these different uses. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that point, which, is kind of sad because I want to compost everything, but also this is something that takes a huge amount of energy to create. So let's try to actually eat it if possible before we bring it to a compost facility.
Thank you, Orion. That's such a good point with the food waste hierarchy. As avid composters, it's a good reminder that it might not always be the best first choice, but it's very good to know that you all can. So we have another question that was typed into the chat box or the question and answer today, which is also from Danny Nelson. Is it beneficial to add fans in garbage bins to increase aerobic activities when collecting food waste for composting? So you might want to elaborate maybe on the process of collection and then processing for that question. You need me to repeat it?
Yeah, I think if I were to ask, are you referring to almost curbside collection bins or roll off containers at the source of collection, whether that be a restaurant? Are you talking more an aerated bin at a compost facility where the food waste is freshly coming in every day and being tipped?
So Danny, if you want to type an answer into, I think you
Curbside
put
collection.
back on there. Perfect. You see that, Riley? For collection.
Yep, curbside collection. I'll kind of speak. We're kind of a small scale, medium scale community hauler. I think for us, fans on our receptacles don't really make that much sense due to the frequency in which we're servicing our containers to satisfy on-site needs for our customers, as well as the aeration you kind of want when you have the mixture taking place with a little bit of the carbon feedstock materials as well when that decomposition process will really be taking place. And so, I think to have fans operating on pure nitrogen food waste would just end up being a sunk cost that really wouldn't ultimately serve your bottom line or the future of that material. But I'd be curious to hear some of the other panelists' insight as well. But that's kind of my personal experience with collection timelines, frequency of service, type of waste in which we're servicing, and ultimate benefit of where air serves in the process of composting.
I would say that, like, I'm going to piggyback on what Riley was saying, that a great deal of aeration within a compost comes from the particle size, and carbon is, I think, when you're talking about collection, really what you're trying to mitigate is odor, which is coming from anaerobic decomposition. And food scraps just rotting in a bucket can be extremely odoriferous. What we try to do with our drop-offs is put a little mulch at the bottom to absorb any excess moisture, and then we can also top it off from time to time with additional mulch so that it's a little less stinky when it arrives to the composting facility. It's kind of a tip if you've got a countertop bucket, even, all of these solutions are things that I think can scale, whether you're talking about, very small scale in your kitchen and bringing out to your backyard bin, depending on what your compost calls for. You may want to add, a paper towel at the bottom or something like that, like similar to mulch or some other carbon addition to help mitigate those odors and add a little bit more porosity to encourage air pockets.
That's really great advice, Muriel. Thank you very much. Okay, I am going to wrap it up because we only have one more minute, but I think that might be a good segue. These are the upcoming events for the North Carolina Composting Council, but I'd like to actually highlight our compost operator training course. It's held in September each year, and it's a 5-day course to professionally train compost operators. So if you're interested in learning more about scaling up or the composting process, the registration will be opening soon. And that's a great thing to participate with. We also have a Sustainable Spirits event in Boone on May 22nd, and an annual meeting for members and supporters in Raleigh on June 11th. And I mentioned our grant application. So if you're in North Carolina and interested in our $1,000 grant opportunities, make sure you subscribe to our newsletter and stay tuned towards the fall when that grant application period will open up. And yeah, if you're interested in getting more involved with us beyond membership, you're welcome to volunteer on a committee or again, join any of our events and subscribe to our newsletters. And I want to share with you all also our contact information for the presenters. If you have more follow-up conversation that you'd like to have with any of the panelists, please feel free to reach out to Muriel or myself, and we are happy to connect you to more of the panelists. So I'm going to stop the share so all of the panelists and presenters can turn on your video just to say thank you so much for coming here today. I know y'all are really busy, and we're so grateful that you could share your expertise with everyone. And to our participants, we hope that you enjoyed this webinar and that you have a wonderful ICAW week and help continue to spread compost and awareness. And thank you all. Have a great day.
Bye. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kat. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kat. Thanks, guys.
Absolutely.
Have a great
Thanks.
day.
Thank you, everyone.
Great panel. Thank you.